Hey guys, welcome back to the shop. We have a few change of plans. A couple of months ago when my customer brought me this, he asked me if I could remove the PTO off of this thing, and I told him sure I could, but if this thing had the PTO, that means that it had the Warner T9 transmission, which is the 4-speed. The 4-speed in these big trucks, was considered the heavy-duty transmission. And it is relatively stronger than the 3-speed, but one of the ways they did that is by having square cut gears in every gear, so that annoying whiny noise you get in reverse in your modern car, this thing does this in every speed. And another downside that I personally can't stand about the T9, sorry, but it doesn't have any synchros, which, okay, leave the comments in the comment section and be kind, but driving a stick shift with no synchros is a pain in the butt. There's a whole lot of this going on. Right, so I warned my customer about that, and he told me don't worry about it, it'll be fine. So fast forward a few months, he got to take this guy out on its maiden test drive, and turns out I was right. Driving this thing is not enjoyable with the non-synchronized 4-speed. So I knew that Speedway Motors made an adapter for this guy to put a T5 behind it, but they use the T5 from an S10, and I thought, how hard can it be to find a T5 from a first-gen S10? And turns out in New Brunswick, it's a lot harder than it used to be. Mind you, the first gen of S10 ended more than 30 years ago, so they're not exactly littering the ground at your local wrecking yard. I did, however, see a couple of Ford version T5s, the ones that were in the Mustang, and actually the ones that GM even used in the Camaros and Firebirds the last couple of years. They actually used a Ford pattern T5 in their cars. So that one's a little bit easier to find. I could find a few of those. So I started looking online, and I found a couple of companies that offered adapter kits for those one as well. So I chose to go with Modern Driveline. I'm not affiliated with them, but shout outs to them. So I contacted them, asked a couple of questions, got some answers from Russ over at Tech Service. So shout out to him as well. And I should be able to put the Ford T5 behind this flathead. So I guess it's time to take out the old so we can put in the new. So let's get the 4-speed out of there. Okay, so I already had the dry shaft out of this thing. I've just removed the counter shaft for the clutch, and I've removed the bolts at the bottom of the bell housing and the 2 bolts that hold the transmission to the mount. Now that is one thing, like you guys might be wondering, why am I doing this on the ground instead of doing it on the hoist? The transmission, these guys can come out either from the bottom or the top. If you've ever seen one of these up front, or if you have one of those, I'm sure you'll notice the inspection cover inside this guy is massive because the transmission can actually come out through the top, and that is the way I'm choosing to do it. I had started considering doing it on the hoist, but since I don't know how long it's going to take me to get my parts, I didn't want to have the thing like dangling in the air with the flathead like kind of weirdly supported, because that's one of the other things, right? If you're used to working on modern engines, the engine mounts are usually somewhere in the middle. So even if you disconnect the transmission, yeah, most of them are kind of tail heavy and they want to tilt backwards, but it's usually not that bad. You can usually support the back of the engine, or sometimes what we used to do is wedge a piece of wood between the engine and the firewall. That way it just tilts back a little bit until it leans on the piece of wood, then it doesn't go any further. On a flathead, you can't do that because the motor mounts are way at the front underneath the water pumps, and the only other mount is at the back of the transmission. So you have the entire drive line supported by both extremities. So if you separate the transmission, it really want to break in the middle, right? So it would have been kind of awkward for me to support the back of the engine with the truck on the hoist for an extended period of time. Whereas now on the ground, I just put a scissor jack underneath the half bell, because that's another thing. These guys have a separate bell housing. It's a two-part bell. I'll show you that in a minute when I have the transmission out. But right now I should have a couple more bolts to take out from the hogshead, the back half of the bell housing, and then I should be able to pull the transmission out and get it out up here. So I'll do that. Okay, so the old 4-speed is finally out. Now let me move you guys in here so I can show you what I'm dealing with for a clutch setup in these old guys. Okay, so for those of you who've never worked on a early F-Series truck, like I said, the inspection cover is huge on these guys, and you can tell here what we're dealing with for the clutch setup on a flathead. You see we had a half of bell housing, or the forward bell, whatever you want to call it. On the 8BA in the cars, this part used to be just made out of stamped steel, but in the trucks it was a big cast piece. And this is what I have, of course. And then we have the pressure plate and our clutch disc. So now I'm going to have to take this guy out so I can take the pressure plate out and replace the disc with this should be an 11-inch disc. Replace it with a Mustang clutch disc. That way it'll have the same diameter so I can reuse my flathead pressure plate and flywheel. But I can have the right size clutch that has the right size input shaft, because this one here is obviously way bigger on the old T9 than it is on the T5. And then on the transmission side of things, we have the back half of the bell, what guys often refer to as the hogshead. So that should unbolt from the transmission, and then I'll be able to reuse all of my stock clutch release, like the release fork, all that stuff, the throw bearing. All the clutch should be stock for the F3. This should work fine. And the only thing is I'll need an adapter, like a sleeve, to go over the input shaft of the T5 so that this bearing can slide on it back and forth so that it mimics the diameter of this guy, because this guy, like I said, is a lot bigger than what the T5 is. The only thing, I don't think these bolts are just for the bearing retainer. I guess the bolts for the hogshead must be from the inside. I guess I'll have to investigate. Well, that sucks. Okay, so I've taken off the top cover, and guess what? There's no bolts in there either, which is what I thought. I was pretty sure the bolts were supposed to be from the bell housing side. So with a little more internet digging, I found out more information. So Ford did change over to the T9 transmission in 1947 or 1948, whatever. So early Ford trucks should have the T9 transmission with the bolt-on bell housing that we're looking for. However, Ford of Canada did not. So Ford of Canada kept using this transmission, this is the earlier version, it's the T8, and this guy has a cast-in bell housing half. So the bell housing is part of the transmission. It cannot come off. So all is not lost. I think that all this means is that instead of using this adapter from Modern Driveline, I'm going to have to use this adapter from Modern Driveline. So I've contacted Russ back at tech support, asked him to send me a few measurements off the forward bell just to make sure I don't have some weird Canadian forward bell or whatever. Right? I think it should be the same, so hopefully this adapter should work fine. So for now, I'll just take the forward bell off, take my pressure plate off, and make sure that I can get the proper clutch in there, and then wait to see if we can get the right adapter for it. So I finally got my forward bell out. And my pressure plate. Pressure plate looks really good. And yes, we do have 11 inches. I'm talking about the diameter of the clutch disc. So that should work out good. And let me throw you back in the truck, show you the flywheel. So I don't know how well this will show up on screen, but the flywheel in this guy, for being 75 years old, looks really, really good. And it is actually drilled for both 11 and 10 inches, right? So we were bolted in here on the outer perimeter. So we have, because we have the 11-inch clutch, but it's already drilled and tapped for the 10-inch clutch if we wanted to. Now I guess I'm going to have to measure the pilot size of the input shaft on my T5, because I'm pretty sure it's smaller than that diameter, because we're going to have to probably replace our pilot bushing. Okay, so one of the first things Modern Drive Lines tells us to do in the instructions, and yes, I read the instructions. Ha! Gay! Is to make sure that their adapter fits on our bell perfectly. So it does locate on the dowel pins. It sits on there good, nice and tight. There's no gaps in between. All our bolt holes line up, so we should be good. Next step. This opening actually has two different sizes depending on if you use a T5 transmission or a T56. So we're using the T5, so we get this yellowish colored spacer ring to have the proper opening. So it says to place it like so, and then use a little bit of applied science to get her on. Ta-da! Now that I have the proper ring in place, I can mount the adapter to the T5, and Modern Driveline gives you the hardware for that. They give you grade 8 bolts. Put them on. So I'm going to build my remote shifter with the transmission on the vent. It's going to be a lot easier than doing it in the truck. So before I said roughly 8 inches that the shifter has to be back, just to be sure, let's do a little more precise measurement. I use a carpenter square on the faces, both bottom, top and bottom. And with the shifter in neutral, we're looking more like 7 5/8. So if I go on the T5, we're over here, 7 5/8 would be about there. And just to have a reference, the edge of this casting here is at 8 1/4. So 7 5/8 will be just a little bit more over here. That's where my shifter is going to have to be. Now, like I mentioned before, on the T5, this bolt here and that one over there are actually shouldered bolts. They have a larger diameter part that isn't threaded underneath the head that's meant to act as dowels to keep your cover located so that your forks are in the right place. So I'm not going to touch those two bolts because I don't want to have to replace them with longer bolts. So instead I'm going to use these two and those two, and because of the shape of the casting here, it'd be like I have a bunch of this 1 1/4 by 1/8 channel. It'd be hard to put it this way because it'd be too close. I probably wouldn't be able to spin the head, so I'm going to have to put it the other way around. And then I'll put one piece like this, put another piece to cap it, drill holes in there so I can slide a socket in to reach those heads if ever I want to remove it, and then place it so I can bolt a plate over the top. And then same thing on this side. And then in the back I'll also have some kind of shelf like that with a bracket, like a big C-shaped bracket that comes and grabs these two bolts of the extension housing, and I'll be able to put my plate on top of that, and I will probably drill the 4 holes and put the bolts from underneath and weld the heads to act like studs. That way I can just sit my shifter on top, put a couple of nuts, and that should hold it in position.